Dixon to discuss the truth about what's going on in the world and how you can protect yourself and your money, and if we're living through an economic reset. Simon, thank you so much for being here. Let's begin this deep dive by giving the people a simple, high-level summary of who really runs the world.
Okay, all right. I've been involved in Bitcoin for 15 years, but before I was involved in Bitcoin, I was part of the monetary reform community. Over time, I kind of coined a phrase called proof of weapons. The proof of weapons network is essentially the fact that the West is fully captured, both politically, on the corporate level. And behind the corporate level, there's all sorts of other factions of power. But right now, if you look at America, for example, the Federal Reserve is owned by its shareholders, and its shareholders are the banks. Those banks are part of a financial industrial complex. It consists of those that create the dollar, which is the private commercial banks, those that create the securities, which is the investment banks, and those that buy the securities, which is the asset managers, the private equity, and the venture capital side. Together, you put together what all these different players, and because most of those companies are now public, they're under the control and they work under what I call a financial industrial complex. Now, the financial industrial complex, because all companies and power structures require access to capital, they're able to utilize and coordinate with other power structures. Now, the structure that really built the dollar and forced the world onto the dollar was the military industrial complex, and that represents the different corporations. Now, most of them are public companies, and most public companies belong to the largest shareholders, are the ones that are able to pool everybody's pension together, so the ETFs. And so it's kind of represented by BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and other large asset managers. As well as the military industrial complex, underneath that, you have the quote unquote deep state. And the deep state is really where the CIA and competing factions that are not accountable and do not work for the interests of national security. About 10% of it is, 90% is to serve the corporate interest, to prop up the dollar through war, and through perpetuating war and getting the resources that are needed for the companies that exist underneath this financial industrial complex. So you have the financial industrial complex where you have access to capital, the creators of the dollar and the poolers of all the capital that can divert money. Underneath that, it uses its investment bank in order to subordinate companies. They get board seats on all of these companies by becoming the largest shareholders, and they subordinate them by giving them access to capital, the bond markets, and everything else through their Federal Reserve and direct dealer network. Now, there are other factions of power, but within this network, this proof of weapons network, you can weaponize finance, you can weaponize military, but the neo-military industrial complex is the technical industrial complex. So this is the ability to run algorithms and dictate behavior based upon social media and everything that exists in these very large, very powerful technical companies. They also get military contracts. They also have backdoors into surveillance and spy networks, blackmail operations. So you can integrate it into the illegal stuff through the deep state, and then you can use various other colonies to do the really illegal stuff and fund all these dark operations. And that's where you have the criminal networks that prop up the dollar as well. But then you have a technical industrial complex, and the final piece of the equation, there's more, is the media. And so the media is obviously weaponized in order to propagate whatever is needed to maximize the returns of the financial industrial complex. So if you want to pump a stock, you have this vast derivative network in order to force subordination. Through the deep state, you have all the blackmail operations to ensure that everyone's compromised. through the access to index tracking funds, you can control through ratings agencies whether somebody gets in the S&P 500, which then gives them access to a steady flow of capital. And obviously you can print the money, and the idea is that you need to leave the government with all the debt for the people and push all the value into the stock market and receive all the yield in the bond market. And that's the game. And then eventually you end up at the end of a debt cycle and you kind of move on to your global financial industrial complex, which is the stage that we're in right now, where essentially you have to partner with other pools of capital. And that's mainly represented by the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. In the case of Europe, that's Norway. In the case of Asia, that's China. And then you have the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and then you have other networks like the Singapore sovereign wealth fund. And so altogether, it's created this transnational capital that is able to utilize the US military industrial complex, weaponize the dollar through the financial industrial complex, fool the people and control the narrative through the media, and then push people into algorithmic social credit scores and artificial intelligence and behavior through the technical industrial complex. Most often in a bull market, they're all aligned and you can manage a portfolio of hedge funds, derivatives, all the, the different things. But sometimes they go off into power struggles. And so we're witnessing a few power struggles. For example, the banks, the biggest and most influential player on the top of the chain is JP Morgan. And then with BlackRock, they're the asset managers. And what you're witnessing right now is a bit of a power struggle for the Fed. Now, most people think that it's the government that's deciding. But remember, the government consists of the three different powers: the Senate, the Congress, and the judicial. They are all prostitutes for power. And so if you want to make it in Congress or Senate, then you have to receive lobby financing. The higher you go, the more compromised you have to be. And you only climb to the top if you're the most compromised, because they need to sustain the power network. And you essentially go out to all your lobbies, military lobbies, financial lobbies, technical lobbies, and all the different lobby networks. And you have to basically deliver. And so each congressman and Senate person, when they receive money, they have to prove their utility to the network. And the more you can prove, the more you can do for military, financial, technical, or other lobby powers, the more money you get, the more marketing you get, the more the media is. And then they try, and as you go up the structure, you get more and more compromised until suddenly you're on an Epstein list at the very top. This is the power structure. And obviously through the deep state, you're able to run these very large criminal blackmail operations to gain control of judicial, to prop up these criminal networks that essentially force the world onto the dollar, pillage assets, and make sure that every country is subordinate, printing their currency to prop up the dollar until no one will buy those bonds. And once people won't buy those bonds, they reconfigure the world by devaluing a currency, pushing capital out to other players in the network, and setting up the next game. And these games tend to happen. There was the British Empire, and then there's the American Empire, and now we're moving to a world of multipolarity. And that's not China versus America. That's transnational capital coordinating and using politicians like Trump in order to reset the order, maximize their returns, and leave the people bag holders of all of the debt.
Love it. Love it. Great framework to continue on this conversation. I could go in so many rabbit holes right now, but I think one of probably the more spicier conversation is what you just said at the end. There's a lot of conversation right now of Trump being the savior. I really like your framework of he's ushering us into a multipolar world. We just saw the World Economic Forum, and one of the big pushes they were talking about, at least from the American politician view, was the end of globalism. So could we dive into how does the end of this unipolar world, where America is the world reserve currency, the main superpower of the world, and then entering into this multipolar world, how does this play out exactly?
Yeah, sure. So I recognized this a long time ago, back in 2000. So the first thing is you need to reject a few concepts. Everything you read in the media, every headline, every social media post is normally coordinated at a higher level of power. And depending on who owns that media, they just are pushing what they want you to believe. So there's no independent journalism. Even if an independent journalist thinks they're being independent, they'll quote their source, and that source will be somebody that's ex-CIA, and there's no such thing as ex-CIA, because these are higher level implants that control narrative. And so if you're analyzing media, the correct way to do that is you need to understand who's funding that media and whose agenda does it serve, and what do they want you to believe. So it's not what is true, it's what they want you to believe. So if you're looking, they obviously have the classic Republican, Democrat, left, right narratives. That's to distract you from real power. They always push out media to galvanize each side. And so that's the first thing you need to understand. The second thing you need to understand is nothing that politicians say is real. Politicians are battering rams to fulfill the mission of their lobbies and make people still believe in the system like it matters if they vote. Money determines who wins the election, and politicians are selected, not elected. And so each flavor of politician galvanizes a certain population, and then they have to play these 2-year games where basically they have to get their next round of funding in 2 years. And then there's an auction, and you have government shutdowns where you have these different auctions. So you have Congress and Senate doing what the lobby said they need to do. They get funding through these different things. And at the top, you've got the president, whose mission is to do whoever they work for. So when you look at a politician, what I first do is I look at who funded that politician. And so if you look at Trump, his number one backer was Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a node for the technical industrial complex that relies upon borrowing against his stock. So he's subordinate to the financial industrial complex. And then they allow him to buy companies like X as long as they push the algorithm into propping up the network on X, which is building a social credit score today. And also he relies upon Pentagon budget. So he's a part of the military industrial complex. If he builds the right technology, which he is given through DARPA and various other CIA venture capital arms, they take the American people's money, hand it over to these entrepreneurs, manufacture them, and if they subordinate to the network and they comply enough, then their stock price goes up and they get richer and richer and richer. But they always need to be subordinate to debt capital markets and equity capital markets and blackmail operations, so they don't go too far off the grid, as it were. So Trump was funded by Elon Musk. Number two was Bank of New York Mellon, the Mellon banking dynasty and family, which is legacy financial industrial complex. And number three was Mariam Edelstein. Now, Mariam Edelstein represents Israel. Israel represents buying the illegal West Bank settlements, which means that they are an operation, a subset of the military industrial complex. Their job is to create divide and conquer in the Middle East and make sure that nobody can ever be stable and create a competing power. Now, what happened with Trump is that he, via his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was married in via the Epstein before Epstein into his daughter-in-law, which was through the Roy Cohn blackmail networks, and Charles Kushner, who did all the who was like Epstein before Epstein, let's call it. He was married into that, and he was funded via a fund called Affinity Partners. Now, Affinity Partners is a multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth fund, Gulf sovereign wealth fund funded VC venture capital fund. So he's got his lobby money for technical, then financial, then military, and that's his priority. He works for the technical, then he works for the financial institutions, mainly the BlackRock money manager pool rather than the JP Morgan pool. So there's a slight faction there. And then underneath that, military, which is Israel. And so you expect him to work in that order, and that's what he does. So the very first thing he announced was the ginormous AI project. The reason that in BlackRock, Rick Ryder, the CIO, is being installed into the Fed right now is because there's lots of the function of private credit markets is broken right now. And so the AI data centers rely on private credit and the buy side, the fund managers, rather than the banks, because the banks are mainly real estate, creating credit to prop up more orthodox Jerome Powell. So Jerome Powell needs to be taken out. Rick Ryder needs to go in. And then you can get all of this AI data center. And you've got to push a big narrative in the media, which is China's about to take over AI, and we're going to strategically die if we don't pump all of this money, roll over the debt, run through the debt ceiling, and then you get to the debt ceiling, and then the next blackmail operation and bribal networks kick in at every phase. So all this to say, but where is his big money? His big money is the Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. And so they managed to use Trump in order to buy a reset of the world order. Now, what happened on that side of the world is you essentially had China that's built up its manufacturing base, has been investing in Africa, the global south, in Middle East. And there was a switch around Trump administration 1, where through fracking, America became energy independent. Once you're energy independent, you become an exporter of oil and gas. Now you're competing with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. So you've got to ask yourself, originally there was a dependency, but now where is this Gulf sovereign money coming from? It's coming from China. So China's buying oil from Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and natural gas, obviously, and all of these different sources, Nigeria. China's building up those countries and basically reversing all the work that the IMF did. The IMF always destroyed countries through covert operations, installed dictators, wiped out their country, and made sure that through corruption networks, it was just working on propping up the dollar. Whereas China's working on building the country so that they can buy their assets. So this created competition to the IMF, which was propping up the dollar, and competition to the deep state and the military, which was propping up the dollar. And now the Gulf countries, basically, China came along and said, Iran, Saudi, you're going to normalize, and we don't want Israel destroying the region anymore and propping up military operations. So we're going to reset the world order. And so Iran started changing their behaviors, shedding their proxies. There was, October the 7th was an operation to reset the order. People think of these things as what they are. Don't believe any of the media. That's all the story to manipulate your emotions into believing that this is based upon something else other than the military-industrial complex operations. So what did you have now? You had Chinese money fueling all the sovereign wealth funds. And so what did they start to do? They started to sell their government debt because they partnered with the force that controls the West, which is the financial industrial complex, the proof of weapons network. So the financial industrial complex managed to negotiate that the military can no longer do forever wars, which back up the dollar. They can't force everyone onto the dollar. And they started breaking the Japan carry trade, the euro dollar, the petrodollar. And then Trump started taking out all the apparatus that propped up the dollar, i.e. USAID, the covert operations. And so he gets to say, we're making America great again, while he weakens the dollar, But what do the financial industrial complex want? They want all the value to go to the stocks, and they want their collateral, which is the bond market, to still function. And so basically the mission is destroy the dollar slowly, not in a sudden way. And so you had these different operations. Everybody else moves out into commodities. The debt rolls over, which would be dumped on the American people. Refinance, re-regulate the private credit market by deregulating the pensions. Allow the dollar to be turned into a surveillance state through stable coins and crypto policy, and then pump up the stocks like crazy, and run the economy hot as possible while they manage their capital outflows. And then tariffs was the perfect way of essentially getting all of the deals renegotiated, bankrupting small business. Because remember, America is an importing country. Tariffs means the importer pays the tariff. The small business goes bust, just like COVID. They get gobbled up. If you look at all the banks right now, all M&A is the number one source of revenue. They just released their financial reports. Military companies are exiting the Middle East, but moving to defense contracts. It's all moving to cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And this is because essentially transnational capital has formed an alliance in a multipolar world. So it's Chinese money based upon manufacturing base and infrastructure that is then fueling the sovereign wealth funds. And Saudi sat down with Trump and said, I want to buy $1 trillion of your equities. Because the dollar is weakening, they can no longer protect the peg on their currency. So they have to sell treasuries or sell gold. They're not going to sell their gold in the current market, so they're selling their treasuries to buy US equities. And when the Gulf sovereign wealth funds partner with the financial industrial complex, essentially all of American innovation can be used in the Middle East to build all these data centers. You can even use the US military to go get a bunch of oil from Venezuela. And so transnational capital from China to the sovereign wealth funds to the financial industrial complex is asset stripping the entire West and bringing all of those military operations back home. So you're seeing lots of civil unrest, colored revolutions, demographic changes, weaponization of algorithms to fuel religious tensions, anything to make the West into civil unrest. So you can asset strip it, push it all into the stock market, subordinate Europe, subordinate all these different Latin and Central America, and just reset the world order into this new reality that the America now needs to look like it's strong while it's shrinking to a regional power, and the world is divvied up for the financial industrial complex. So there's no confrontation here. The powers that control America are working with the sovereign wealth funds fueled by China, and they're splitting up the world into the various regions that transnational capital will control.
So it sounds like, as the old George Carlin quote was, it's a big club and we're not a part of it.
Absolutely. But all you need to do is stop reading headlines, stop believing in politicians, stop believing that there's a political solution and that you can vote your way out of it, but just follow the money. And for the last 25 years, all I've done is follow the money. And when you follow the money, I'm just a geek that looks at every aspect and all financial statements. It's a leading indicator into what's happening in the world. And the only countries that are going to not be vassalized into this network and power structure are the ones that were able to use their resources, use their currencies, not to give more power to the banks. So the dollar and the Federal Reserve System is a debt-based Ponzi scheme to subordinate the entire country to the real power and subordinate the government to the real power, the financial industrial complex. Whereas other countries, their banks are part of an infrastructure that maintains the capital in, like China and the sovereign wealth fund countries. And then they use their resources in order to protect their economies, build their sovereign wealth. And then that becomes a weapon that you can use to negotiate with the financial industrial complex. And if you're not being subordinated and vassalized, that's where the highest birth rates are. And so once you've got those birth rates, BlackRock's looking, saying, right, the West is full degeneracy, full polarization, suicides at the highest rates, birth rates are at the lowest rates, drug addictions are at record highs. All these people that went and fought our wars, they're come home, they're homeless, they're mentally ill. And so all you can do with that country is turn it into a police and surveillance state, Orwellian nightmare, and maximize it through, your nodes like Palantir, and take that technology and all those things that you did around the world and bring it back home. And so that's the tension that we're witnessing right now.
Got it. 100%. Okay, guys. So I'm going to take a quick commercial break. We'll come back. I actually, before I do that, Simon, a lot of people say that you're a doomer. I don't think of you as a doomer when you're just explaining what's going on. As a Bitcoiner, we know what the solution is. But what is your response to people saying, man, Simon, like, this sounds like a lot of doom and gloom? What is your view when people say that about you?
I just don't really care. All I care about is accuracy. And so, I've been publishing all of my forecasts for 15 years since I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference when I was a monetary reformer. And what I say is never popular. A couple of years later, it tends to come back and people say, okay, I see what you were doing now. I'm not here to give hopium. I'm not here to tell you the world is better than it is. I'm not here to tell you the world is worse than it is. I'm here to tell you from my experience, having worked in investment banking, having built business and understand how venture capital and public markets work, having understood debt markets, having been an investor in, I was an investor in Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, Bitfinex, Circle, all the largest companies that made our industry. And I've seen them go from a little mission to support Bitcoin to being subordinate to the financial industrial complex, to go and you have to engage in. I've seen this network 100 different times. I've invested in these companies. So that is coming from, you're probably in the West. Now, the fall of the West, or the slow decline and vassalization of the West, is good if you're rich. Is very good if you're rich, but the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. And you need to know how to manage that. Now, if a storm is coming, you just want to know what's going on. You don't want to be lied to. You need to get a raincoat, get an umbrella, fix your roof, and start getting to work at what you need to do to protect yourself. And politicians and media, they're lying about everything right now. But here's the bullish message. You also need to decide where you want to live. Because if you're living in a country where the cities are going to go to shit and you can't afford to move, you need to get more rural. And you also need to know that the fall of the West is the best news in the world for countries that have been on the other side of the military industrial complex bombs. This is Africa's time to utilize their resources. This is the Middle East ending the forever wars. Tens of millions died, death and destruction. This is Asia's opportunity to rise. And so capital doesn't disappear. And then you can either live in a fantasy and a reality where your politicians are lying to you about absolutely everything, or you can accept that this is how it is. And I don't advocate for anything. I only care about accuracy. And if I'm wrong, I'll say it. But I don't think I'm wrong about these things. And you can get prepared, or you can look for some hopium. But there is trends here. And so doomerism is great for other countries. And that's the world. We're just shifting. Capital is shifting. And you need to decide how you're going to make your moves, how you're going to protect yourself, your family, your community, and those around you.
Got it. Love it. Okay, guys. So quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about how Bitcoin fits into this. I do want to touch on, the place of gold and silver currently. They're on historic runs. I want to, continue to dig your brain about the geopolitics and the macroeconomic state that we currently are seeing right now. As you mentioned, we are seeing a monetary reordering happen in real time. And I think a lot of people are missing what they should be watching. So after this quick commercial break, we'll touch on all of that. We'll be right back in 1 minute. Actually, Simon, before we touch on the things that I just mentioned, it looks like our audience on Simply Bitcoin is still a little confused, and they're wondering, who is the financial industrial complex exactly? So maybe we can dive into the different factions, the financial industrial complex, who they are, what they're represented by, and then I think most people are pretty familiar with the military industrial complex. So as the audience wants to know, what is or who are the main players in the financial industrial complex?
Yeah, so the post-World War II Bretton Woods order was built upon the military-industrial complex, but as the markets grew and grew and grew, access to capital became the primary source of funding. And so the military relied upon Pentagon budgets, so the ability for the bond market to continually roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme. Now, because the government is fully subordinate and dependent upon the bond market functioning, because to have world reserve currency, you need to export dollars globally and you need to roll over the Ponzi, which means you need to perpetuate debt, an ever increasing level of debt. And so that requires selling more bonds. So the first thing is the bond holders. So who are the bond holders? That's a really important thing. If you look at today, $65 trillion of US assets are owned by foreign countries, foreign sovereign wealth funds, central banks, and various other foreign, pension funds and asset managers. So you have the bond market. You also have basically the creators of the dollar, which is the private banks. So JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank. Now, they're able to create a dollar every time they issue a loan. And they have to continually increase those loans because essentially, because they create all dollars, the interest on the dollars doesn't exist. And so your job is to create a mechanism for collateralizing all those dollars. So rather than lending to business, you tend to lend in speculative assets and real estate. Then what you do is you take all of that real estate, because every time you issue a mortgage, you get to roll over the debt. You get consumers into debt, governments into debt, and corporations into debt. Now, if you're a large corporation, the closer you are to the 0% money, the more power you get. And so obviously the closest is the banks and financial institute, the banks that are able to create the dollar. Now, they also have a partner, which is the investment banks. The investment banks is to take every business and turn it into a product that they can control. And so they want to fill companies with capital. They want to float them on stock markets for the equity capital markets, and they want to load them up with debt through junk bonds and various other mechanisms. And if they're cash flowing, they can also get some of the bank debt if the company's big enough. So you create all these weapons, and then you also create derivatives so that you can manipulate those share prices, and you use hedge funds and asset managers in order to control those share prices and launch covert operations to destroy bond markets, currency markets, equity markets. So they control the market, and the more debt you load up with, the more equity you sell them, the more subordinate to the financial industrial complex you become. That goes into different layers. So at the very bottom of the layer, you have, for example, Silicon Valley, which is loaded up with debt from the asset managers, the financial industrial complex. So they're not like, just people think that they're like these rich people that set up these VC funds. They're loaded up with debt, and their debt comes from subordination to the financial industrial complex. So they have to outperform the debt by finding companies to invest in and putting in a structure where the entrepreneurs become subordinate to these venture capitalists. And they have it where in order to grow, you need to get access to more and more capital. Seed, Series A, Series B, Series C. And as you get bigger and bigger into the next round, you become more and more subordinate to the governance structure of the financial industrial complex. Now, maybe you can get access to private equity, which is if you don't comply with the network, then your company can be turned, into a distressed asset when it's loaded up with too much debt. And the venture capital, the private equity industry can asset strip you, buy you in distress, subordinate you, and hand over your assets to the companies that are most compliant with the network. So you got JP Morgan at the investment banking level, Barclays, Citibank, all the other different ones, and it's transnational as well. Now, they mainly list on the US stock market. They also list on European markets and various other stock markets, and so what you need is a mechanism for becoming the largest shareholder in all of those companies. And that's where the asset managers come in. The asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they essentially get access to your capital because you decide, rather than buying shares, you'll buy an ETF. That ETF becomes a mechanism for continually, as people invest more and more in those ETFs, it's like a constant bid of capital, because if it's an S&P 500, it has to own all those 500 stocks in a weighed way. And so by you paying your pension, you contributing, you paying your insurance premiums, you give more power to the asset managers. Now, the largest asset manager is BlackRock, which manages about $12 trillion of these assets. They can then create ETFs for every commodity, every currency, every index, every market. And once they become a majority shareholder, they get to control the board, or at least have a board seat. So in a company, in a corporate structure, you have the executives like Elon Musk. They work for the board. The board is mainly appointed by the investors, and the board works for the shareholders. Now, the shareholders is normally a bunch of small, give up their proxy to the large asset managers. And then you start managing state funds and all these different funds. And it's a pay-to-play system. The more you contribute, the more you get to buy the West. And also, they have sovereign wealth funds, which are also their investors. So like the Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund is one of the largest foreign investors in BlackRock. Once you become a shareholder in BlackRock, you get significant influence over the collective West, because they create constant flows through ETFs into European markets, Japanese markets, all the markets that they try and subordinate. And then they get access to military, where they can go do covert operations, destroy countries, get them to use their central bank to hyperinflate their currencies, get the hedge funds out there to destroy their currencies, and just subordinate a country so you can asset strip it through venture capital and through private equity, and push it into the public market stock. So essentially, you have different degrees and factions of power within a financial industrial complex. It currently represents, across the key nodes and key players, about $30 trillion of capital, but a bunch of that is foreign controlled and foreign owned. And so through that network, you control the government through the financial lobby, military lobby, technical lobby. And so then you get Senate, Congress, and all those. So it is a network of sophisticated financial institutions that are coordinated through the largest asset managers. There's often power struggles. People think it's like an organized cabal. It's not. There are people that get chucked off the network, and it's a ruthless power struggle. And almost all of them are compromised to ensure compliance. And to kind of keep the network survival is that mechanism. And that is what rules the West. And that is what tried to subordinate as many countries as possible through wars, through death, destruction, ethnic cleansing, genocides, criminal networks, rape, pillaging, stealing. And the goal is you have to use your currency to lend it to the US government, so that bondholders can subordinate the government, and then we can prop up the value through the equity capital markets.
Okay, so you mentioned asset managers, ETFs, and the audience is now wondering, how does Bitcoin fix into this? And actually, one of my favorite, I guess, perspectives from you right now is that most people, I think, are being distracted by where the war is coming from. And I may be grossly oversimplifying, but I love the idea that the real attack is coming from Wall Street on Bitcoin. So can you explain that mechanism, and where do you think Bitcoin currently is in its history, in its projection of where it's going to go?
Yeah, sure. So whenever a new asset class comes along, so what is the idea behind central banking? Is that once you have a central bank, you need to co-opt the private sector. So if you think about Britain, the British Empire, you had the three nodes. You had the government, and their job is to just be the piggy bank and leave the debt with the people. Then you have the Bank of England, whose job is to co-opt the currency and redirect it for corporate interest and, and banking interest. And then you have the wealth extraction vehicle, which was the British East India Company. So what the British East India Company is, it would use governments would provide legitimacy to the pound, and then the pound would be used for the benefit of the central banks and the banks, and then the extraction would happen via the British East India Company. It would go create wars to essentially steal resources and turn shit currency, shit coins like the pound, into gold and silver. And at the end of it, you end up with all the gold and all the silver, and the people end up with all the debt. And then you move to the next empire. And an empire typically requires a war to change or a currency destruction vehicle or massive capital outflows. So World War One and World War Two was the transition from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. So you took you put a revolution within Russia and you replace the Russian Tsar with the Soviet Union and communism, and you fund the Bolshevik Revolution. You fund the fascists, the Reichsbank, which is a member of the Bank for International Settlements. They essentially funded, the Nazi Germany movement, and they also were. If you look at the Federal Reserve, the Reichsbank governor and the Federal Reserve governor in the 30s were the Wahlberg brothers. And so through this mechanism, you have fake capitalism, fascism, and communism. All of it was funded via Wall Street. And then you create a war in order to destroy currencies. And then all of the gold from British colonialism ended up in Fort Knox, backing up the Federal Reserve, and became the base to build the manufacturing base and the military industrial complex. And so anytime a new commodity comes along, you utilize fiat currency to steal it and centralize it as much as possible. So Bitcoin was created in 2008. We had the launch of it in 2009. I bought my first Bitcoin at $3 and spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011. I wrote the first published book in 2011. And launched it at that conference. And so what Bitcoin does is, originally, I personally believe it did come from intelligence roots, but it was a gateway drug to what's happening today: stable coins and CBDCs, crypto shitcoins, programmable money, real world assets. You will own nothing and be happy, World Economic Forum, surveillance state nightmare, basically crypto capital. And so crypto capital is the mechanism for how you steal all the assets and give everyone a tokenized shitcoin where they own nothing and they're happy. And then you get to do types of operations where essentially what do you want in the end? Well, you want all the Bitcoin, the real asset. And so, Bitcoin became open source. It became an escape valve. And so those that were able to use Bitcoin in self-custody, they didn't lose them on exchanges. They didn't custody it. They ended up with becoming the new elite within Bitcoin. And then there's multiple operations to try and co-opt parts of the Bitcoin ecosystem. But because it had these nodes, these miners, these developers, and these users, every time co-option happened, we kind of had resistance movement, and we had these spectrums of resistance. And that's been Bitcoin's entire history that most people don't even know. But eventually, Wall Street decided that they wanted to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible, get as much of the Bitcoin mining as possible, and attempt to gain control over the Bitcoin developers as much as possible. And so various operations were launched. We had through people like the Bitcoin Foundation, then moving into MIT, then moving into developer funding, And then we had competing implementations and various other things that happened throughout that time in order to try and blackmail developers. They had operations where essentially 60% of the mining was happening in China. And then suddenly we had the China mining ban that resulted in 40% of the hash power being pushed over to Texas, pushed into the Texas grid. And also Wall Street then took those companies and made them public so that they could essentially gain as much control over some of the mining hash power through the American stock markets and the typical mechanisms. We had multiple attempts at shitcoins and forks. Different nodes were created like Blockstream, that was funded by various factions of the financial industrial complex to try and push psyops like, say, Craig Wright is Satoshi, and then Gavin Andreessen supported that, and then you had Roger Ver supported that, and then you had just different types of psyops that led to Bitcoin Cash and various other things. And obviously you had the old Ethereum thing and all this. So they started building the proof of stake control grid, the surveillance state, the Silicon Valley shitcoins. They were supplementing their VC portfolios by launching all of these altcoins that were pre-mined, dumping them onto people and ending up with everyone, as much Bitcoin within Silicon Valley as you could. So you centralized it initially into Silicon Valley as much as possible. Then you tried to get as much in Wall Street. And so you created the Bitcoin Treasury Company. Now they're creating borrow against your Bitcoin, push more custody. Then they created, things like the ETF. You had Operation Choke Point 2.0. Remember, they always use the two-party system for uni-party operations. So you had come after crypto under the Biden administration, hostile takeover, various operations connected to Mossad like Celsius, various hacks that were done by Netanyahu's niece and nephew. All of these different coordinated hacks and takedowns make the industry look really bad, wipe out the banks that you wanted to roll up. And then in comes Trump. And then you get the BlackRock, the banks, the favorable structure, the crypto lobby, the legislation that allows for confiscation of Bitcoin. You take the samurai wallet people, you look at all the people that were being arrested, and you just arrest the one that's working on CoinJoin's self-custody. You then co-opt different nodes like Coinbase through Larry Fink, and then BlackRock becomes very positive towards Bitcoin. Everyone gets tax incentivized to roll up a bunch of that old Bitcoin, put it in Bitcoin treasury companies. And then people are like, well, it's very tax efficient. I don't want to learn how to self-custody. And so you buy the Bitcoin BlackRock ETF. You create companies and legislation where banks can use it as collateral. You create stablecoin regulations where you co-opt someone like Tether. So Tether is essentially using the government debt to build a massive Bitcoin position. And then they're building out the largest private Bitcoin mining network. And then obviously you do, by Tether, you have a kill switch on these stable coins. And then you use different nodes like Elon and X to build out your social credit score, Peter Thiel to build out your AI surveillance state, David Sachs in order to build out your crypto capital. But essentially all this to say is that they want you to borrow their Bitcoin, leverage your Bitcoin, hold custody of your Bitcoin, and they want to centralize it, as much of it, into the proof of weapons network as possible. And then you've got nodes like Cantor Fitzgerald that can allow, take companies like Jack Mallers, 21 Capital, roll them up into SoftBank, Cantor Fitzgerald, Tether, roll up Strike into that, get everyone to borrow against their Bitcoin. And then using companies like Strategy, they can load it up with corporate debt. They can build different types of constructs where they're able to sell the Bitcoin if they can't raise enough debt. You fully subordinate Strategy into the financial industrial complex. And essentially within a few years, they managed to get access to centralize, 2 million Bitcoin. And then through a company like Strategy, you can basically utilize it and the derivative complex to try and control the short-term price of Bitcoin, get people levered up with debt, get people to mine fiat currency by borrowing against their Bitcoin, and just create this network to do what they did with gold and to do what they did with silver, which is you control the short-term price, you utilize it to try and get as much of the asset you really want, which is gold, silver, and Bitcoin, and create financial weapons of mass destruction to lever people up with debt so that you end up with as much of the Bitcoin as possible. That's the Wall Street attack. The Trump administration was installed for the technical, financial, industrial complex in order to get the Fed to be taken over by BlackRock for monetary policy, get the debt rolled over and the stock market up, and then devalue the currency, and then stable coins can take out as much of that government debt and yield. And he's basically hedging himself with Bitcoin, with investments in the Middle East, and he's essentially short the dollar while he's doing it.
Okay, I have a lot to unpack, but I do have to hit a commercial break. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about what you just said. Yeah, just give me Okay, Simon. So, point blank question. Do you think Bitcoin has been co-opted since the ETFs were launched?
Bitcoin is the most decentralized thing that we have in the world. And it's not going to take on power, but it is going to give you an exit and a boycott. So people think that we're going to take down the financial system. The financial industrial complex, the FIC, realized that they need to adjust to this reality. And they've co-opted as many players as they can, and they continue to do that as much as they can. All this to say that Bitcoin is still the most decentralized thing we have. But the rich will get richer. The financial industrial complex will do very well out of Bitcoin. But your job, if you really care about Bitcoin, is we need a community that still believes in what Bitcoin was created and how it was originally designed. We need people running nodes. We need people owning their Bitcoin in self-custody. We need people that aren't borrowing against their Bitcoin through a centralized structure. And we need people that are going to support different types of innovation that allow for privacy on layer twos, circular economies in the countries that need Bitcoin the most. And so everything I originally set out, when I originally started investing in Bitcoin companies, I invested in BitPayzer because they were bringing Bitcoin to Africa. I invested in UnoCoin because they were bringing Bitcoin to India. I invest in RTM that was bringing Bitcoin to Venezuela and Argentina. I invested in Bitso that was bringing Bitcoin to Mexico. They have centralized and created a dependency. And the reason that Bitcoin is not going the way that gold is going right now when it's meant to be going at is because everybody gave a chunk of it over to Wall Street, and they're in the accumulation phase and doing what they essentially did to gold and silver. And so congratulations, it was always going to happen. As we succeed, Wall Street, we're going to co-opt as much of it as they can and accumulate as much of it as they can. And they have every power structure to be able to do it. But we still need to maintain a core community, and we still have that, that is actually going to be deciding, running those nodes and deciding which implementations of the code, of the node code that they're actually running. And we still have that community. And so it's still the most decentralized thing we have. And the reason that I know it will succeed is because I believe the reason that Bitcoin was created in the first place was the same reason that the British Empire created the tax haven islands. It's an escape for elites that still want it as well. The rest of you were meant to own Bitcoin in custody, and you were meant to be a gateway drug for getting everybody onto shitcoin, stable coins, and real world assets, which is happening under the Trump administration right now. But elites still want that exit. And our job is to recognize that this is probably the only asset. Not everyone can get a seat on the table when your country goes to shit and end up in Cayman Islands or one of the islands designed, or Singapore designs for the elites. But everybody can get their own little part of Bitcoin in self-custody and run a node and support the network. And so I'm confident we survive. But the mission of taking down the financial industrial complex, no. A chunk of Bitcoin is co-opted into that, And so we are in partnership. And your job is to recognize, do you want to fund death, destruction, war, violence, and fund the proof of weapons network, which is Bitcoin in custody? Or do you want to actually boycott, make the system weaker, and at least have a corner of the world that's working on allowing people to be sovereign? Because the only countries that are going to survive in this multipolar world order and not be vassalized into the FIC are the countries that have sovereign wealth. The companies that don't have VC funding or Wall Street or subordinate to the FIC and have their own Bitcoin strategic reserves independent of these custodial relationships, and the individuals that are able to say F you to the system because they kept Bitcoin in self-custody. I understand it's more complex than that. There's tax incentives, there's financial planning, there's inheritance, all the system is designed to subordinate you to the debt-based Ponzi scheme, mine fiat currency, and end up with Bitcoin in custody. Just like gold. Very few own their gold. Instead, they own an IOU gold with paper claims that essentially allows them to manipulate the price of gold and silver. And that is why they do it. So all this to say is that I still think that Bitcoin will achieve its purpose. It's an exit and a boycott, but very few will do that. And most of you will be useful idiots that will give more power to the financial industrial complex on the wrong side of a margin call, mining fiat currency, while they take your Bitcoin and use it as leverage to destroy your pension, bomb more countries, and you work for transnational capital.
Okay, so Simon, you mentioned gold and silver. I think our audience, I'm sure your audience is very familiar with what happened with gold and silver last year. There has been this meme or this idea of if some of the profits from gold and silver roll over to Bitcoin, it's going to go parabolic. So from your opinion, what is going on with gold and silver, and what is it telling us about the future of Bitcoin?
So just like the military industrial complex had to lose out from its revenue from all the wars in the global south and Middle East and Asia Pacific, they need to come home to make up for lost profits, because the financial industrial complex created a model that persuaded to do that. So the MIC had to give up on profits, and they had to compensate them with Europe and Latin and Central America. But the FIC managed to get the MIC to do that. It is the same, type of thing with gold as well. The financial industrial complex, because they are working with sovereign wealth funds that have leverage, and there are much higher returns by just utilizing the liquidity of the US stock market and burdening all the debt onto the people, manufacturing a surveillance and police state in the West, use the technical industrial complex, and then they can leverage all those assets in negotiating with countries that have higher profit. But the FIC had to recognize that reality and look for higher returns. That comes with the sacrificing slowly of the dollar in order to unwind positions and use their capital outflow, which is why most stock markets are outperforming the S&P. Even shit coins like the pound, the euro, the Japanese one's a bit, it's an important one in the node network. But, we're seeing a weakening of the dollar relative to other shit coins and fiat currencies. But it is absolutely plummeting with gold, because the financial industrial complex told their network of central banks that are members of the Bank for International Settlements that we are now coordinating a slow transition to box America into a regional power. And therefore, we need to sacrifice the dollar as world reserve currency. The FIC are now having to build BRICS-denominated types of financial products. So the reason that all the stock markets, even though London and UK is being sacrificed, pushed into surveillance, pushed into demographic challenges, destroyed and asset stripped economically, the stock market's still at all-time high. That's because they're taking the dollar-denominated assets and slowly transitioning to subordination of each country, where the government use their currency to prop up those stock markets, and they're starting to denominate these financial products in other currencies. And then it launched a series of currency wars. One of them was to break the Japan carry trade. And so suddenly everyone in the world is putting down interest rates, but Bank of Japan's putting up interest rates. That repatriates a bunch of capital. Suddenly Trump wages war on Europe. That was done through the Biden administration. Ukraine is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. It is a war between asset stripping for the financial industrial complex and Europe. The goal was to destroy Europe, hand over parts of Ukraine to Russia, and carve up the rest for BlackRock to get the rare earth minerals, to get the land, and to create a nice wall between Russia and the Western Hemisphere. And so you had the similar escalations where everything's looking like chaos in the Middle East, but moving towards peace. And so you're getting all of these different carvings up. That's because the financial industrial complex has need to recognize its new reality, that it now needs to subordinate as many countries in the global south, which is what tariff policy was. What tariff policy did is it drove the world to BRICS, which helped China split the world up into multipolarity and India. It also helped Russia resolve, but firstly, they want to take $1 trillion out of Europe. They want to confiscate a bunch of money, push all that up to the US stock market. That's why Trump started getting NATO to pay for more. Escalate the war. There's no peace that's being negotiated there. That one will go on a little bit further. And you basically bankrupt US small business through the import tax, get a bunch of, roll them up into the multinational corporations. And the large multinational corporations can offset their tariff by acquiring companies like the export-dependent companies in Vietnam, Cambodia, various other nodes. So the ones that don't have sovereign wealth, they all end up in these large multinational corporations. M&A goes up. The world transitions to multipolarity. America shrinks into regional power. The stock market acquires all the value. The debt is rolled over and the currency is taken down. So then you do a theatrical war on Europe. So you push narratives like at the World Economic Forum, like the Zelensky humiliation ritual. And essentially, you kind of create a narrative to the American people. The British Empire, we're taking on the banks, the Europeans, the European banks, we're taking on the deep state. So you deconstruct everything that propped up the dollar. Now, remember, the deep state gets its power from the Bank for International Settlements. Who's the number one shareholder in the Bank for International Settlements? The Federal Reserve. Who's the Federal Reserve owned by? The American banks that are on the public markets, on the US public markets. Who are they owned by? The asset managers, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Who's that owned by? Yeah, of course, there'll be, legacy elite structures, but it's not exactly owned by, the City of London or anything like that. It's owned by legacy elites that are losing more relative wealth because the European empire, fell, the American empire rose, and now the Chinese empires rose. So now you've got capital, affiliated with Gulf countries, capital affiliated with China. So these massive pools of competing wealth are now negotiating with this financial industrial complex. And what you do is you paint a narrative. So your previous guest, I'd never heard of him until he called me MI6. He's pushing out that narrative that we're taking on the European bankers. Trump is taking on the deep state. The cartoon comic book geopolitical analysis that you can get from Fox News and BBC, based upon the media that is pushed out by the deep state. And if you follow the money, you realize that no, that power is all encompassed in public US stocks. And the deep state props up the dollar. And if you take on the deep state, you're strategically telling the world, no more covert regime change, no more currency wars, no more death, destruction, rape, pillaging of your countries, no more installation of dictators, no more national endowment of democracy, covert operations, no more pretending you're funding aid by USAID when you're doing money laundering operations to fund your drug cartels and all the deep state operations that fund these different things. You know, MI6, Mossad, Five Eyes, CIA, they're one network to continue the flow of drugs, and they're propped up by their shares in military industrial complex, and power shifts based upon wealth dynamics. And so, you know, that's where who the Bank for International Settlements are. And then finally, when you weaken the dollar, you break the pegs, the Hong Kong dollar, the Saudi currency, you get them to sell their treasuries. And then also, you know, you push everyone, all the foreign central banks, you tell them, load up on gold, sell your treasuries. And the only people that aren't selling their treasuries are UK, Europe. What does that tell you? UK and Europe are subordinate to the same financial industrial complex that controls America. You know, Canada, Australia, Europe, UK, Israel, the whole West, they're subordinate to the same financial industrial complex, and they're just shifting capital around. And no, Trump's not taking it on. Trump represents a pure faction of the technical industrial complex and financial industrial complex. He isn't a neocon. He doesn't represent what Biden, which was military industrial complex power, you know, and he's more on the BlackRock side. You will own nothing. And that kind of integrates between technical and financial and asset management. That's what Trump represents. And so, you know, that's what he is here to do. He's not taking on the Federal Reserve. He's reshaping the Federal Reserve for BlackRock to make sure that this surveillance state has all the capex it needs to dump the debt on the American people and put it in pensions at artificially low rates, while the long-term bondholders are saying, pay me more with higher rates.
Interesting. Okay. That makes perfect sense to me. I do have to play one last commercial break. And I think that's the end of this conversation, Simon. I do want to open it up to the audience. They've been asking a lot of questions in the audience to clarify some things. So, guys, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I do see Simon's chat as well, so I can answer both of your guys' questions. Last commercial break, and then we'll wrap this up with like a Q&A.
Before we go back, I forgot to even answer the question. Gold, central banks. Silver is an AI industrial play. And so the silver side was take those paper contracts. Everybody in the financial institutions that gets on the wrong side of this will be bailed out by the Fed, and that's already happening. You move from QT to QE. They get their bailouts. You socialize the losses, privatize the gains, and then China comes along, constricts the supply, and that resets all of these silver supply chains, AI data centers, eastwards, while America just becomes a data center and all of the energy needed to power all of this artificial intelligence. So the silver play is you had Japan carry trade, euro dollar, petrodollar, silver, gold, and then managed decline of the dollar to box and move into this BRICS and GCC and sovereign wealth fund transnational capital.
Okay, Simon. So first question I have by Wade Davies. He says, why promote Bitcoin when precious metals are God's money?
So I love precious metals. I believe in gold. I believe in silver. They are escape valves. But the problem is that most people can't own it in custody. And so they end up just owning an IOU paper version and giving more power to BlackRock and the financial industrial complex. Now, some people are able to hold a bunch of coins and various other things. But when you're dealing, as your wealth grows, it doesn't scale. And so I believe that people need wealth that they can escape their country. They can go with them wherever they want it to go. They can self-custody it. And it has the full flexibility of the tyrannical state, you know, that many countries are pushing towards right now. And so the answer is that, okay, great. If you want to own gold in self-custody, virtually everybody owns a paper version of gold, which means you don't own your gold. And that's the one that will be, you know, confiscated, used to leverage or whatever. That's not God's money. Now, if you do actually own gold and you can hold it and you have a way of securing it and you have a way of scaling it, the problem is you can't spend it. And so Bitcoin is significantly easier to spend and self-custody. And then when you go on the border and you try and escape at scale or spend internationally, you just end up giving more power to the financial industrial complex. So use gold for what it is. If you can hold God's money, then hold God's money. More power to you. But Bitcoin in self-custody solves some of the problems that you can't solve with gold. And so to me, if you're not boycotting the system, you are empowering the system. And virtually everybody empowers the FIC by holding their gold and then allowing them to leverage, and you only own a paper contract. And you're seeing right now, when you actually try and get it, most people, it's a clunky, horrible system for actually trying to take delivery on God's money.
Awesome. Okay, Simon, this next one, I think you just answered this one, but I'll read it anyways. If you want to add more to it, it goes, what does the average person need to do to offset or leverage the new financial industrial complex? I think you answered self-custody Bitcoin, but if you want to add more to that, Simon, by all means.
Yeah, I'll do it. If you want to boycott the Federal Reserve and the Bank for International Settlements, then own Bitcoin, gold, or silver. If you want to boycott BlackRock and the asset managers, then you have to not own it through an ETF. You have to own it in self-custody. If you want to boycott the banks, you don't borrow against your Bitcoin and don't use it as collateral in custody. Even if you end up borrowing some stable coins and dollars, you're still empowering the system. Here's what I want to say. Nothing's perfect. Look, you're never going to get perfect. Every decision you make is either worse or better. I still have to use an iPhone. I know that I'm building my social credit score on X. I know that I should be on Nostra and I'm using the alternatives, but sometimes you have to be more effective and still opt in to a certain degree. But what I want everyone to commit to every single day is owning more Bitcoin than you owned yesterday, or owning more Bitcoin this month than you did last month, and getting better and more sovereign, because that's the key. So rather than investing in the S&P and funding wars, you can invest in local businesses. You can use your Bitcoin to do some good and build community and real value in the real world. Rather than purchasing from these global networks online, purchase from your local farmers. And there's a side effect. Try and figure out how to actually eat more locally grown food that doesn't go through these horrific processes. So think that your vote doesn't matter. That unless you're wealthy, unless you're rich, you can buy politicians and you can engage in politics. The real vote is your money. Boycott things that you don't want. Hold it in self-custody and just commit to improving your flows of money, and work in the local communities and build like these circular economies. That's how you do it. And depending on how wealthy you are, how sovereign you are, there'll be degrees by which you can do that. Some people are deep in debt and they've got to try and figure out, do I pay off that interest right now, or do I put a little bit into Bitcoin? What's the right ratio? What am I going to do here? Just really have a plan and think for 10 years. Don't put together a 1-year plan. If you put together a 1-year plan, you'll say, what's the next Bitcoin killer? What's the next shitcoin I can buy? I'm going to leave it on an exchange so that I can trade faster. All the wrong decisions. They are pushing you into degeneracy on poly markets, gambling, just everything they want you to do is probably the opposite of what you should do. So just be very conscious of your money and recognize there isn't perfection. You're not going to get everything right. I recognize the reality. Just get better.
You brought up, if you're rich enough, you can buy politicians. And this is coming from me. What was your takeaway from the last election when Bitcoiners really lobbied and put a lot of money behind the Trump administration? What was your initial take of that? And what is your, in hindsight, view of Bitcoin and politics combining?
Yeah, one of the reasons I love the Trump administration is because it's allowing me to exit my positions where I'm no longer ideologically aligned with the company. They're all going public, so I had very early investments in Coinbase, in Kraken, in Exodus, in Robinhood, in Circle, and I think a few more of them going public, but they're all going public now. I think the next one's Kraken. The reason is because, look, once you are subordinate to the financial industrial complex, you are no longer independent. You work for them. And so you end up maximizing your revenue for non-ideological based mechanisms by fiduciary duty in order to raise the next set of capital and support your share price. There is a very buoyant crypto lobby, but it's not that powerful. So the crypto lobby was built, when Trump came to Bitcoin 2024, I think it was. We started to have all the politicians kind of turn and slowly get these crazy people into becoming nodes for the proof of weapons network. And everyone started supporting Wall Street and politicians and all the very influential company that were now at this stage, from very small companies that couldn't get VC funding that I was investing in, to multi-billion-dollar unicorns that are working for their good venture capitalists to generate returns. They created the crypto lobby, and the crypto lobby became important, but it's nowhere near as powerful as the banking lobby scene. We got to understand where we are right now. And so what it actually did was it partnered with the asset managers and the BlackRock and the asset manager faction of the financial industrial complex. So when you see Brian Armstrong pushing right now, remember who he really works for. He really works under the asset managers, and there was meetings he had with Larry Fink, because it's only when you partner with Larry Fink can you actually take on the banks. And the banks and the asset managers are managing their portfolio. And suddenly you get language taken out around self-custody. Suddenly you get the banks being able to create their own yield on their own stable coins. And suddenly, so the crypto lobby, I believe, is fully co-opted into the financial industrial complex. They're throwing you a few things, and obviously they control significant chunks of their little faction of power within the financial industrial complex, but they're fully subordinate at this stage, and it's only under a corporate structure that you can justify the money needed to buy all these prostitutes and politicians to get what you want.
Okay. I love that perspective. Okay. We have Stephen Livingston. He asks, what does America look like with no dollar? I think maybe the question is, what does America look like with a weaker dollar? Because you never said no dollar. So I think that would be the reframing of this question. What does America look like with a weaker dollar?
Yeah, I don't believe we hit hyper Bitcoinization and all fiat currencies die. Like, I recently did a debate with Jeff Booth on that one. I believe fiat currencies, power shifts and they create a new fiat currency power structure, which is what we're witnessing right now. Very few will escape. And so you just get a new group of elites and a bunch of people that hopefully come along. And that's why I still, 15 years later, I'm still advocating for people to own Bitcoin in self-custody. But America, I believe, will always have a dollar, just like, the British Empire still had the pound, but the pound just becomes a tool for bad growth, propping up the stock market and subordinating wealth. So the stock market of US is the most liquid in the world. It's a very useful tool. So America, the people, become subordinate to the stock market, and the dollar gets weakened and weakened and weakened slowly, like it is right now. And it becomes a regional currency, because if you pegged your currency to the dollar, the weakening means that you have to defend that peg, and people won't do that forever. And so it becomes more and more regional. And one of the interesting things that they did in Venezuela, they continued selling. So the White House continued selling the oil at a discount to China via Chevron, because they're still transnational capital. China's an important node in the network. Chevron still wants the revenue to prop up their share price. Exxon came along and said, we need the price of oil to be $80. So they said, we can't do anything with it. They need $200 billion of capital. So they're probably going to get Gulf capital. Remember, the refiner in Texas is fully owned as subsidiary. The one that can take advantage of it is fully owned as a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco. And so essentially, the dollar becomes a tool for transnational capital more and more and more. The military becomes a militia rental for extraction of resources. And the technical industrial complex becomes a brochure for the surveillance and police state. And so you manufacture civil unrest, which weakens the dollar a little bit further, and it creates the narrative needed in order to slowly remove the constitution, usher in various parts of martial law, beta test on UK, use Palantir, use the border security as the narrative for massive surveillance, digital IDs. In America, you'll always have a stable coin because remember, America is optimized for corporate interest, whereas Europe and all the others will get a central bank digital currency and a digital euro, because the power structure is that these are like vassals, and so they push the power up through government power up to corporate power in America, and then it's asset stripped, and then through the American capital markets, it's invested globally, and the people, it just gets worse and worse and worse for the people, unless they own the assets and they figured out their exit strategy. Less and less people are able to do that. That turns into civil unrest. Then you get the police state and the surveillance state. So it just gets worse and worse unless you're in the elite, and your job is to make sure that you're managing that transition. Now, what they did in Venezuela is they immediately co-opted Tether into freezing some of the oil sales that were being done in Tether. The Bitcoin and self-custody that was rumored, that kind of disappeared. That probably went into a corrupt power structure because probably Maduro agreed to what happened and was negotiating. The stock market went up 300%. And that was all elites and a few banks. It's not like distributed across the people. The oil still flowed to China, and they froze the Tether. Now, what does that mean? Think of what happened when the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve implemented sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia. Everyone went for de-dollarization. And so what I'm expecting to happen is that the Fed and the financial industrial complex will destroy many currencies in Central and Latin America, dollarize it into Tether, build out the surveillance state and control grids, and all the other countries will say, I'm not using Tether because that's a weapon, just like the dollar was weaponized against Russia. And so you signal to the world, don't use Tether in your country, but the Western Hemisphere, they can dollarize and implement Tether and stable coins in order to build out these control grids across, and you dollarize as much as you can, but you do it regionally and detracting it from penetrating in countries. And so expect more and more currency wars. Like Scott Bessent already did one in Iran to destroy the savings of the Iranian people. And obviously you had all the Latin America ones. I expect more dollarization regionally. And of course, the value will just go down and down and down, and you need to protect yourself. And they need to, because they need to protect themselves from some of this massive inflation from running the economy hot. There's only 3 ways to combat inflation. You tax more, which is what tariffs were, a tax on American small business, because that takes money out of the system. So it's disinflationary. Or you get the price of oil down, or you create massive productivity increase, which is AI and robotics. So basically the entire Western Hemisphere, as well as other regions, are being rebuilt to host data centers, artificial intelligence, robotics, creates mass unemployment. And as that creates civil unrest, you use technological surveillance state, and then you push capital outflows by weakening the dollar, but the dollar stays a regional currency, and it will be programmable, and 1984 Orwellian surveillance state nightmare social credit score well, you will own nothing and be happy.
Okay. Trying to wrap my head around, is this kind of saying like we are entering kind of a bimetallism future? Like, where does Bitcoin fit here as the neutral money for the world? As if, I mean, obviously there people or central banks are going to hold gold. We're going to have some, digital fiat monstrosity and Bitcoin. So maybe it's not a bimetallism future, but I have a feeling that I think all three of these are going to have a place in the future. So what is your take? Is this like, are you explaining kind of a bimetallism future?
Lots of fiat currencies, multipolarity, currency wars, and currency wars drive people to the neutral assets. At the moment, the financial industrial complex wants more Bitcoin. So it's trying to take as much Bitcoin from you by fooling you into leverage and treasuries and ETFs. Once it's got sufficient amount of Bitcoin, at the moment, it will use its derivatives complex. But we're partnered in this scheme. And so there'll be Bitcoin in self-custody, sovereign freedom. There'll be countries that have built their Bitcoin strategic reserves the right way. El Salvador, sadly, at the moment, the IMF is still in charge. You've got two choices in Latin and Central America. You either become a surveillance, technical, industrial complex node with the IMF, or you've built enough Bitcoin in strategic reserves and you partner with the rest of the world and you end up like Venezuela. So El Salvador is playing that game. IMF is still in charge, but they managed to build their Bitcoin strategic reserves and hopefully they can build some sovereign wealth. I'll continue to watch that, but they didn't get their Bitcoin backed bond because of that. But essentially you have sovereign people with Bitcoin in self-custody, those that are in the financial industrial complex, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and you have countries that are actually able to look after their people because they have sovereign wealth rather than becoming a vassal. And Bitcoin's role in that is the boycott, the exit. They'll try and short-term oppress the price of Bitcoin, I believe, to accumulate as much as possible. Buy into that because it is a scarcer asset than gold, a scarcer asset than silver. The stock to flow has made it, the world's scarcest digital asset, but you got to be patient. If you're looking for a quick return, if you have a 10-year plan, own more Bitcoin every month, enjoy the ride. Sadly, it's not going to take on power because they have co-opted it, but we're in partnership, but you boycott by owning in self-custody. And we will never get another Bitcoin. It's not coming again. The set of circumstances that led to this open source code with nodes that can resist against miners and resistance against all the attempts of centralization and power dynamics, there's never going to be another one of those. And I think it makes it. And I still will continue to think that Bitcoin is the best place to park your capital if you want sovereign freedom. Boycott the system, and I think everybody's going to be fine. If they're long-term, if they're traders, borrow against it, leverage, you'll get wrecked and you'll become a tool for power.
Well, Simon, getting close to the end. I with that last message, I don't think anyone could really call you a doomer, but I started the podcast with asking you the question of who really runs the world. And I think this might be the perfect question to put a bow tie on today's conversation. We have Blessed Exile, and he goes, question, who is the final boss? Maybe I'll reframe this. Who is the final boss for Bitcoin? When, or I don't even know if you'd frame it this way, but when would, or what would be the signals in your mind to show you that Bitcoin finally won?
I don't think Bitcoin finally wins. I think Bitcoin just becomes a higher and higher market cap over time. And as long as we can continue to have competing developers and we resist against all attempts at centralization, that the miners are geographically diverse across countries, so that countries that hate each other start to use Bitcoin mining as a tool, and people continue to run nodes, and we don't have an expensive node network, and everybody, or at least enough people, are able to own Bitcoin in self-custody. We've already won. We were never meant to get this far. When we were just a bunch of people in a conference in Prague with about 100 autistic, crazy, people that just wanted to take on the banks, we were never meant to succeed. Like, the fact that we got here is an absolute miracle. And Bitcoin is to be cherished. And we just need to maintain a community of people that continue to do what Bitcoin was designed for. And we need to just bring on as many people as possible, and just recognize that there's going to be people that own Bitcoin in self-custody, and there's going to be everyone else. So continue pushing out education, try and bring as many people with us, teach long-term thinking, stay away from gambling and degeneracy. And we've already won. But, the people that are short-term minded, they've lost. If you're a long-term thinker, you got a 10-year plan. Thank God for Bitcoin. It was a miracle that we got this far, and that we've got this during this radically changing moment. The next 5 years will be 200 years of change. You won't recognize the world. And you're going to need community to get through this, because there's multiple psyops to make sure that you're not protected. And I think Bitcoin's a lifeboat.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for coming on. I truly enjoyed this. I know I'm going to have to rewatch the more dense conversation at the beginning, but we really went full circle here. It might have seemed dark and doomy in the middle, but towards the end, I think there was a hopeful ending to today's conversation, Simon. So thank you so much for coming on today's show. It's truly been a pleasure.
Yeah, I do. If you want to follow me on X, I do real-time analysis as the events happen. And I do the other thing that I've got a discipline. I don't need to do it. I just do it because I've managed to free myself from all of these traps of the financial industrial complex. Every week I follow the money in Bitcoin and tech. I do an hour, then I do an hour on This Week in Macro, and then I do an hour on This Week in Geopolitics. And I just actually follow the money in each of those areas. And I upload those to my YouTube channel. So feel free to subscribe. No sponsors, no adverts, no monetary gains, no pushing you into a business. Just trying to get as many people prepared for what comes next. So those are my two best places.
Really appreciate Simon. And I highly suggest that our audience here on Simply Bitcoin give Simon Dixon a follow. I've been following you for the last year, and I've really appreciate all of the work that you've done, Simon. So thank you once again for coming on the show and for what you do. It's truly been a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you.